The first thing I saw when I drove up to my ranch was a bulldozer. Not parked. Working. Its blade was pushing a long strip of dirt across the pasture where my fence used to stand. Orange survey flags were planted every few feet in a straight line that cut directly through the middle of my land. A crew of construction workers moved quickly behind it, unloading rebar and wooden forms like they had a schedule to keep. Then I noticed the sign. A giant development board at the entrance of the pasture. Ridge Creek Estates, Phase 2 Expansion. Under it was a glossy map showing 40 new houses. All of them sitting exactly where my grazing field used to be. At the bottom of the sign was the project budget. $18,400,000 development project. I stepped out of my truck slowly, still wearing the same boots I'd come home from deployment in. The HOA president was already standing near the construction trailer, holding a clipboard like she'd been waiting for this moment. She glanced at me once, then pointed toward the line of survey stakes running across my pasture. "Those markers show the corrected boundary," she said flatly. "Your ranch doesn't extend this far." Then she gave a small shrug. "You really should have reviewed your paperwork before leaving town." Behind her, a concrete truck began backing toward a freshly dug foundation trench. I didn't argue. Didn't raise my voice. I just pulled out my phone and started taking pictures, the survey flags, the permit taped to the trailer window, the construction plan nailed to the board. Because something about this felt wrong. Surveys don't erase deeds. And if their map was somehow correct, then how were 40 houses suddenly being built on land my title had owned for nearly a decade? If you enjoy stories where patience, evidence, and the right document turn the entire system upside down, make sure you're subscribed to the channel. Because sometimes the loudest people think they've already won, right before the one piece of paperwork changes everything. I bought the ranch 8 years ago, back when this valley was still quiet enough that you could hear wind moving through the trees at night. At the time, I was already serving in the Army Logistics Corps. My deployments were predictable, long stretches overseas, followed by a few months back home. I wanted a place that didn't feel temporary. Somewhere stable. Somewhere that didn't change every time I came back from another rotation. The ranch checked every box. 38 acres of open pasture bordered by a line of old cedar trees on the north side and a shallow creek running along the eastern edge. The land had been used for grazing decades earlier, but most of it had been sitting untouched for years. No major structures. No complicated zoning. Just quiet land with a long dirt driveway leading back from the road. I had the property surveyed before I bought it. The lines were clear, the deed was clean, and the county records matched perfectly. In my line of work, documentation mattered. If something wasn't recorded properly, it didn't exist. For the first few years, the ranch stayed exactly the way I liked it, simple and predictable. But about 2 miles down the road, something started changing. A developer purchased several hundred acres of farmland and began building a new residential neighborhood called Ridge Creek Estates. At first it was just a few model homes and paved streets, but the project grew quickly. Within 3 years the development had its own entrance gates, clubhouse, and a homeowners association board that managed everything inside the neighborhood. Technically, the HOA had no authority over my ranch. My property sat just outside their boundary lines. But that didn't stop their president, Elaine Carter, from introducing herself not long after construction started. She showed up one afternoon while I was repairing a fence near the road. Well-dressed, confident, carrying a leather folder full of development maps. According to her, the neighborhood planned to expand toward my side of the valley eventually. She explained that buying a narrow strip of my land along the western boundary would make their future layout much cleaner. I declined politely. The ranch wasn't for sale. Elaine didn't argue. She simply smiled, closed her folder, and said something that stuck with me longer than I expected. "Development has a way of reshaping things," she said. "Property lines change more often than people think." Then she got back in her car and drove away. At the time, it sounded like the kind of comment developers make when they're trying to negotiate. But 6 months ago, I deployed overseas again. And while I was gone, Ridge Creek Estates announced something new. Phase 2 expansion. When I returned home, the new development map suddenly included part of my ranch. Which meant somewhere along the way, someone had decided that my property line had moved. The morning after I returned from deployment, I drove the full perimeter of the ranch like I always did after being away. It was a habit. When you spend months overseas, the first thing you want to see when you get home is that nothing changed. Halfway down the dirt road that ran along my western fence line, I saw something that immediately felt wrong. The fence was gone. Not broken. Not damaged. Removed. In its place stood a straight line of bright orange survey stakes, stretching across the pasture in a perfectly measured row. The line cut diagonally across the grass in a way that didn't match any boundary I'd ever seen on my property maps. And beyond those stakes, heavy equipment was already working. 2 bulldozers. A grading machine. Several pickup trucks with construction company logos on the doors. The sound of engines echoed across the field as the machines carved long trenches into the soil. I pulled my truck to the side of the dirt road and walked toward the nearest worker. The site supervisor noticed me approaching and met me halfway across the field. He looked calm, almost routine, like he'd already had this conversation before. "You the ranch owner?" he asked. I nodded. He gestured toward the orange survey flags. "We're working off the updated boundary survey," he said. "Development permit came through 3 months ago." He handed me a folded set of papers clipped to a clipboard. The top sheet was a new survey map. According to the document, the original ranch boundary had been recorded incorrectly years ago. The corrected survey shifted the line more than 100 feet into my pasture. Just enough space to create an additional row of housing lots for the Ridge Creek development. 40 houses. The supervisor pointed toward a large sign posted near the equipment trailer. "Phase 2 expansion," he said. "Your land's inside the new layout." I didn't argue. Didn't accuse anyone of anything. Instead, I took out my phone and began photographing everything: the survey stakes, the permit posted on the trailer door, the map attached to the construction board. Then I asked one question. "When was this survey filed?" The supervisor checked the paperwork. "Late spring," he said. "About 3 months back." 3 months ago. Right in the middle of my deployment. That afternoon, a certified envelope arrived in my mailbox. Inside was an official HOA notice stating the same thing the supervisor had already told me. The development was moving forward. The boundary had been corrected. And any attempt to interfere with construction would expose me to liability for project delays. But while I was reading through the letter, something on the final page caught my attention. At the bottom of the survey certification was the name of the engineering company responsible for the boundary change. It wasn't the company that had surveyed the ranch when I bought it. In fact, I had never seen that company name anywhere in my property records before. The next morning, I drove into the county records office. I didn't go there to argue. I went there to verify. In logistics, the first rule is simple: never rely on one document when a system has multiple records. If the survey filed by Ridge Creek Estates was legitimate, it would appear across several county databases: planning permits, property plats, and archived survey filings. The clerk behind the counter pulled up the parcel map on her screen and typed in my property number. For a moment, everything looked normal. The ranch boundaries appeared exactly where they had always been. Then she refreshed the system. A second map appeared, an updated survey layer that had been filed earlier in the year. The line had moved. Just like the construction supervisor said, the new survey pushed the western boundary more than 100 feet into my pasture. Enough land to fit an additional row of residential lots inside the Ridge Creek development. "Looks like a correction filing," the clerk said casually. "Developers submit those sometimes if an older survey had an error." I asked her when the document had been approved. She checked the record. 3 months ago, she said. Same timing the construction supervisor had given me. I requested copies of everything connected to the change, the survey report, the approval forms, the permit attachments. While the clerk printed the packet, I studied the digital map on her screen again. One detail stood out immediately. The survey approval stamp didn't come from the county survey office. It came from the Development Fast Track Desk, a department that normally handled subdivision permits and building applications, not permanent boundary corrections. I didn't comment on it yet. I simply collected the documents and left. By the time I returned to the ranch that afternoon, another letter was waiting in my mailbox. This one came directly from the Ridge Creek Estates HOA board. Inside was a formal notice titled Boundary Verification Cost Assessment. According to the letter, the HOA had paid for the new survey that corrected the historical boundary error. Because the correction benefited both property owners, they were assigning a portion of the cost to me. $9,800 due within 30 days. 2 days later, another letter arrived. This one listed additional charges connected to the development expansion. $3,400 infrastructure adjustment fee. $1,200 administrative processing cost. The total amount now claimed against my ranch was $14,400. At the bottom of the letter was a warning. Failure to pay could result in further administrative action. While the paperwork kept arriving, construction on the pasture accelerated. Bulldozers finished leveling the ground along the new survey line. Wooden framing appeared where the first foundations would be poured. Trucks began delivering pallets of concrete blocks. From the ridge above the field, the project looked organized and confident, like the developers had no reason to believe anything could stop them. Instead of confronting the crew, I started doing something else. Every day I documented the site. Photographs. Permit numbers. License plates on construction vehicles. Copies of every letter the HOA mailed. By the end of the week, a thick folder was forming on my desk. Then the next certified envelope arrived. This one came from a law firm representing the Ridge Creek Development Group. The letter stated that if I interfered with construction in any way, blocking equipment, removing survey stakes, or disputing the boundary publicly, I could be held financially responsible for delays. Estimated damages for interrupting the project were listed at over $500,000. It was the kind of number meant to make someone panic. But one detail inside the survey approval packet still bothered me. Because the office that stamped the boundary change wasn't actually the department that normally had the authority to approve one. About 2 weeks after construction started, the HOA announced a community meeting. The email invitation said the meeting would clarify recent questions about the Ridge Creek Phase 2 expansion. But judging by the tone of the message, the real goal wasn't clarification. It was control. The meeting took place in the Ridge Creek Clubhouse, a large room with rows of folding chairs facing a projector screen. Nearly every seat was filled. Residents, developers, board members, and several people I didn't recognize who were probably connected to the construction company. At the front of the room stood Elaine Carter, the HOA president. Behind her was a large projected image of the new survey map. The same one I had seen on the construction clipboard. She waited until the room settled before speaking. As most of you know, she began, our Phase 2 expansion required a detailed boundary verification with neighboring parcels. She clicked the remote. The map zoomed in on the western edge of Ridge Creek Estates, right where my ranch sat. The updated survey corrected a historical recording error, she continued. Unfortunately, one nearby property owner had been using HOA land for several years without realizing it. The room shifted with quiet murmurs. Elaine didn't say my name, but she didn't need to. Everyone in the room already knew who she was talking about. She pointed at the highlighted strip of pasture now labeled as part of the development. For years, fencing was placed beyond the actual property boundary, she said. The HOA allowed that situation to remain out of courtesy. But once the expansion project began, the correction had to be made. It was a carefully constructed story. One that made it sound like the HOA had been patient, generous even. Then she moved to the next slide. A financial chart appeared on the screen. Because that land was used privately for so long, she continued, our legal team is reviewing potential back-use assessments. The number appeared at the bottom of the chart. $86,000. A few people in the audience turned to look at me. The implication was obvious. According to Elaine, I hadn't lost land. I had been occupying HOA property for years. And now the HOA might charge me for it. Through the entire presentation, I didn't interrupt. I sat near the back of the room with a small notebook on my lap, writing down every statement, every figure, every slide number. Elaine eventually noticed the silence. Her eyes moved toward the back row. You're welcome to comment if you'd like, she said calmly. I shook my head. No comment tonight. The meeting ended with applause from several residents who believed the issue had been settled. Within hours, the HOA sent a mass email summarizing the meeting. The subject line read, Boundary issue resolved, development continues. Over the next few days, construction intensified again. Concrete trucks began pouring the first foundations. Utility trenches were cut along the newly marked lots. From the ridge overlooking the pasture, the site no longer looked temporary. It looked permanent. Then a certified letter arrived from the HOA legal office. Inside was a formal notice stating that the board had begun the process of placing a property lien on my ranch. The amount listed was $128,600. The document explained that the lien covered survey costs, administrative fees, and projected development losses tied to the boundary dispute. And if the amount remained unpaid long enough, the HOA could begin proceedings that might eventually lead to forced sale action against the property. 3 weeks after the lien notice arrived, the situation reached its worst point. Another certified envelope showed up in my mailbox. This one came from the same law firm representing Ridge Creek Estates, but the tone had changed. The language was more direct now, less procedural and more final. The HOA had officially recorded the lien against my ranch. According to the document, the total amount owed had increased to $128,600, including survey costs, legal processing fees, and projected development losses tied to what they described as ongoing interference. The letter also listed a deadline: 45 days. If the amount remained unpaid past that date, the HOA could move forward with additional legal steps to recover the balance. The notice didn't use the word foreclosure, but the meaning was clear enough. A forced sale process was now legally possible. By the time I finished reading the letter, construction across the pasture had progressed even further. 10 house foundations were already poured. Wood framing had started rising on 2 of the lots closest to the road. Utility trenches stretched across the field like long scars in the soil, and stacks of lumber sat waiting beside them. The transformation was happening quickly. Anyone driving past the ranch would assume the development had always been planned there. Even the clerk at the county office sounded uncertain when I spoke with her again. Once construction is that far along, she said carefully, these kinds of disputes become complicated. Complicated was another way of saying unlikely to reverse. The HOA board certainly believed that. A new email circulated through the Ridge Creek neighborhood that same week announcing that Phase 2 construction was proceeding without further boundary concerns. From the outside, it looked like the dispute was finished. The HOA had paperwork. The developer had permits. The county system now displayed the new property line. And my ranch was carrying a 6-figure lien tied to the dispute. Everything suggested the same conclusion. The HOA had already won. But before leaving the county office that afternoon, I asked the clerk for one more thing. Not the development permits. Not the survey packet. I asked for access to the county's original master boundary atlas. Because if the survey line had truly moved, then somewhere inside that archive, the county's oldest map should show it. The county archive room sat behind a locked door at the end of the records hallway. Unlike the digital parcel maps used by the public counters, this room still held the original survey atlases, large physical maps stored in flat metal drawers. Some of them dated back decades, long before the county converted most records into electronic systems. The clerk unlocked one of the drawers and carefully pulled out a thick paper map almost the size of a table. "This is the Master Boundary Atlas," she explained. "Whenever an official property line changes, the update is recorded here." She placed the atlas under a bright desk lamp. The map showed the entire valley, every parcel boundary drawn in thick black survey lines. Roads, creeks, farmland divisions, and property numbers were all marked clearly. It didn't take long to find my ranch. Parcel lines surrounded the 38-acre block exactly the way I remembered from the original survey when I bought the property. Then the clerk pulled up the new Ridge Creek survey map on her computer screen so we could compare the two. Immediately, something felt wrong. According to the new development survey, the western boundary of my ranch had shifted more than 100 feet inward. That shift created the strip of land where the new housing lots were now being built. But on the master atlas, the line had never moved. The original boundary still ran straight along the same position it had always held. I looked back and forth between the two maps. "Shouldn't the atlas show the correction?" I asked. The clerk frowned slightly. "It should," she said. "Any permanent boundary adjustment normally required a formal amendment to the master atlas. Without that update, the change technically wasn't recognized across the county's official mapping system, which meant something unusual had happened. The Ridge Creek survey had been approved, but the one map that legally defined property lines for the entire county still showed the original boundary. And that raised a much bigger question. Because if the atlas had never been updated, who actually had the authority to move that line in the first place? The clerk and I stood over the master atlas for a few minutes longer, comparing the printed map with the development survey on her screen. The difference between them wasn't subtle. On the Ridge Creek survey, the boundary line bent inward across my pasture like someone had pulled it sideways with a ruler. On the master atlas, the line remained perfectly straight, exactly where it had been recorded decades earlier. That map wasn't just a reference drawing. It was the county's legal backbone for land boundaries. Every parcel adjustment, subdivision, or correction eventually had to appear in that atlas for the change to become permanent. But there was no update here. No amendment stamp. No replacement sheet. The line had never moved. The clerk leaned back slightly in her chair, studying the atlas again. "That's strange," she said quietly. "Boundary corrections normally require an atlas revision. Otherwise, the change isn't recognized across departments." I asked her a simple question. If the atlas never changed, how did the development permit go through? She opened the survey packet again and began scanning the approval pages. The answer showed up quickly. The survey had been filed through the Development Fast Track desk, the same office that reviewed subdivision layouts and construction permits. Under that system, survey documents attached to a development plan could be reviewed quickly to avoid slowing large projects. But those reviews were limited. They could approve lot layouts inside a property. They could approve road alignments or drainage plans. They were not supposed to authorize permanent boundary changes between parcels. Those approvals normally required the county survey office and sometimes even a public notice process. The Fast Track desk had simply stamped the survey and moved it through. The atlas never changed because the office that approved the document didn't actually control the atlas system, which meant the survey that moved my property line had passed through the wrong authority entirely. That alone was a serious problem. But it still didn't explain something else. Even if the development office had stamped the document incorrectly, the county survey department would normally catch the mistake when the permit packet reached them. I asked the clerk if there were any older records attached to the ranch parcel. Something that might explain why the atlas boundary had been so rigid. She opened a deeper archive folder connected to the property number. The documents inside were older than most of the digital files, scanned copies of records dating back several decades. One of the first pages carried a title I hadn't seen before. Federal Agricultural Easement Corridor, Soil Conservation Program. The clerk adjusted her glasses and read through the first paragraph slowly. The document explained that many rural properties in the valley had once been part of a federal conservation initiative designed to protect farmland and watershed soil from overdevelopment. To qualify, certain parcels were recorded under a federal agricultural easement. The easement didn't prevent owners from using the land, selling it, or building structures within it. But it did something else. It locked the original parcel boundary into a federally recorded conservation corridor. Any attempt to move that boundary, even a small adjustment, required federal review and approval, not just county paperwork. The clerk looked back at the atlas. Then at the development survey again. The strip of land Ridge Creek had claimed through their corrected boundary sat directly inside the easement corridor recorded in the federal document, which meant the survey filed by the developer had skipped an entire layer of oversight. No federal review. No environmental clearance. No authorization to alter the easement boundary. Technically, the county fast-track office had approved a survey they didn't have the authority to approve. And the development permit had been issued based on that survey. The clerk slowly leaned back in her chair. If this easement is still active, she said carefully, the county can't move that boundary on its own. I asked the obvious question. What happens to construction permits that rely on the change? She didn't answer right away. Instead, she picked up the phone and called the county planning department. The conversation was quiet but tense. I could hear pieces of it from where I was standing. Federal easement record. Boundary correction inside the corridor. Permit approval may need review. After a few minutes, she hung up and looked at me again. They're going to pull the development file, she said. Within 48 hours, the situation changed faster than it had in the previous 2 months. A notice was sent to the Ridge Creek Development Company ordering a temporary halt on construction activity while the permit packet was reviewed. County planners began examining the survey approval process. And a request for clarification was sent to the Federal Agricultural Registry tied to the easement corridor. By the end of the week, inspectors had already visited the construction site. They walked across the pasture measuring the same survey stakes the developer had installed earlier. Only this time they were comparing those markers to the boundary recorded in the federal easement file. Every measurement produced the same conclusion. The new development line crossed directly into protected easement territory, which meant the 10 concrete foundations already poured into my pasture had been built under permits that might never have been valid in the first place. Word of the review reached the HOA board quickly. Construction equipment stopped moving. Concrete deliveries were canceled. For the first time since I returned from deployment, the pasture was quiet again. But the real impact of the discovery wasn't the construction delay. It was what the county planning director scheduled next. A public permit review hearing. Because once federal easement restrictions entered the picture, the development approval process could no longer stay quiet. And the Ridge Creek HOA board was about to find out that their survey map was only one document in a much larger system they hadn't checked. The county permit review hearing was scheduled for the following Tuesday morning. By the time I arrived at the county administration building, the hallway outside the meeting room was already crowded. Developers from Ridge Creek Estates stood near the door speaking quietly with their attorneys. A few residents from the neighborhood had come as well, curious about why construction on Phase 2 had suddenly stopped. At the center of the group stood Elaine Carter, the HOA president. Her posture was still confident, but the atmosphere around her was different now. The easy certainty she had carried during the community meeting was gone. In its place was a tight focus on the stack of documents her lawyer was reviewing. Inside the room, the county planning board sat behind a long table facing several rows of chairs. The planning director opened the hearing with a brief explanation. This session concerns a review of development permits issued for Ridge Creek Estates Phase 2, he said, specifically regarding boundary survey approval and potential conflict with recorded land easements. He nodded toward the developer's table. Let's begin with the survey documentation used to establish the new parcel boundary. The developer's attorney stood first. He projected the same survey map that had been used during the HOA meeting weeks earlier. The line that cut across my pasture appeared clearly on the screen, creating the strip of land where the new homes were planned. Our engineering firm conducted a boundary correction based on historical measurement discrepancies, he explained. The corrected survey was submitted through the County Development Fast Track Review System and approved accordingly. The planning director leaned forward slightly. Approved by which office? The development permit desk, the attorney replied. The director nodded once. That office can review subdivision layouts, he said calmly. It does not authorize permanent parcel boundary changes. A quiet murmur moved through the room. The attorney adjusted his papers. Our understanding was that the submission fell within the fast-track guidelines. The planning director gestured toward the county survey officer seated beside him. Mr. Talbot, did your department review this boundary correction? Talbot shook his head. No formal request was submitted to the county survey office, he said. The master boundary atlas was never amended. A large printed copy of that atlas page appeared on the projector screen next. The thick black boundary line surrounding my ranch ran straight and unchanged. Exactly where it had always been. Then the planning director placed another document on the screen. The Federal Agricultural Easement Corridor Record. The room grew quieter as the director summarized the key section. This parcel boundary forms part of a federally registered conservation easement corridor. Under federal land protection guidelines, any modification to that boundary requires federal review and environmental clearance. He looked toward the developers. Was such approval obtained? The attorney didn't answer immediately. Instead, he consulted briefly with the survey engineer seated beside him. After a moment, the engineer spoke. Our firm was not informed of any federal easement affecting the boundary, he said. The planning director turned a page in the file. The easement record has been attached to this parcel since 1987, he said. The implication hung in the room. The survey company had never checked it, which meant the entire boundary correction had been built on an incomplete property review. But the real impact wasn't the survey mistake. It was what that mistake meant for the construction already underway. The director pulled up the final slide. An aerial image of the Phase 2 site. 10 concrete foundations were visible across the pasture. Utility trenches ran between them. Every structure sat inside the easement corridor boundary. The director spoke again. Without federal authorization to alter this boundary, the survey used to approve the development permit is invalid. A quiet shock moved through the audience. The attorney for the developers leaned forward. We've already poured foundations on those lots, he said. The planning director nodded. We're aware. He paused before continuing. Which is why the county issued a temporary construction halt last week. Elaine Carter finally stood up from the HOA table. This situation is based on a misunderstanding, she said quickly. Our board acted on the survey provided by the engineering firm. The development approval was granted by the county. Her voice carried a hint of the confidence she'd used during the HOA meeting. But the planning director didn't challenge her tone. He simply looked down at the permit file again. The approval was granted under an office that does not have authority to alter parcel boundaries, he said. And the survey used for that approval did not account for a federally recorded easement. The room fell silent. For weeks, the HOA board had been presenting the dispute as a simple boundary correction. Now the discussion had moved into something much larger. Permit authority. Federal land protection rules. Potential liability for construction inside a protected corridor. The planning director turned toward me. Mr. Walker, he said, referring to the ranch parcel owner listed in the record. Do you have any statement you'd like to make regarding the boundary in question? Every person in the room turned to look. I stood slowly and walked to the front table. I placed the original deed copy and the atlas page beside the permit file already open on the desk. Then I spoke. Not loudly. Not angrily. Just clearly enough for everyone in the room to hear. Land records don't move because someone wants them to, I said. They move when the right authority changes them. No one responded immediately. The planning director nodded once, then closed the folder in front of him. The board members exchanged quiet words with each other before the director turned back toward the room. All permits associated with Phase 2 construction inside the easement corridor are now under formal review, he said. And the decision the county delivered next would determine whether the Ridge Creek expansion could continue at all. The room remained silent for several seconds after the planning director finished speaking. Everyone in the audience seemed to understand that the hearing had crossed a point where the situation could no longer be handled quietly. What had started as a boundary dispute between a ranch owner and a homeowners association had now become a permit investigation involving county authority and a federally recorded easement. The planning director opened a second folder in front of him. Inside were the inspection reports that had been completed during the previous week. He read from the summary. County inspectors confirmed that 10 residential foundations and associated utility trenches have been constructed within the federally recorded easement corridor tied to parcel 1847. The aerial image of the construction site returned to the projector screen. Concrete slabs sat clearly inside the corridor boundary line. The director continued. Because the survey used to authorize the development was approved by an office without jurisdiction over parcel boundary changes, and because the federally recorded easement was not reviewed during the permit process, the development authorization cannot currently stand. The developer's attorney leaned forward immediately. "Are you revoking the permit?" he asked. The planning director answered carefully. "We are suspending the permit until the easement issue is resolved." He paused before explaining the practical meaning of that decision. All construction inside the corridor must stop immediately. No additional work may continue under the current approval. The developer representatives exchanged uneasy looks. Stopping the project meant more than a delay. Concrete foundations had already been poured. Equipment had been rented. Contractors had been scheduled weeks in advance. Every day the project remained frozen would cost thousands of dollars. But the planning director wasn't finished. He turned to the county survey officer again. "Mr. Talbot, based on the Atlas record and the federal easement documentation, does the county currently recognize any adjustment to the ranch boundary?" Talbot shook his head. "No, sir. The master boundary atlas still reflects the original parcel line." The director nodded. "Then for all county purposes, the original boundary remains the legally recognized line." That statement alone erased the survey correction Ridge Creek had relied on. But it also triggered a chain of consequences the developers had not expected. The director continued reading from the permit review notice. Because the development project relied on an invalid boundary correction, the property lien filed against the ranch parcel is not supported by the current land record. A few heads turned toward Elaine Carter again. The director looked up from the document. "The county will notify the clerk's office to remove the lien associated with the disputed boundary fees. The lien that had been hanging over my ranch for weeks, $128,600 in claims and penalties, was gone in a single sentence." The planning director moved to the final part of the ruling. The developers will be required to submit a revised permit application reflecting the correct parcel boundary and the federal easement corridor restrictions. Until such documentation is approved through the proper review process, the construction work currently located inside the corridor cannot proceed. The meaning of that instruction was obvious. The 10 concrete foundations sitting in my pasture had been built in a place where houses could not legally exist under the easement restrictions. Which meant the developer now faced two options. Attempt to secure federal approval to alter the easement, something that could take months or even years. Or remove the structures already built inside the corridor. The room was quiet as the planning director closed the permit file. An additional administrative review will examine how the boundary survey was approved through the fast-track office, he said. If procedural errors occurred, appropriate corrective action will be taken. Several members of the Ridge Creek HOA board shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The development company representatives looked far less confident than they had when construction began. Weeks earlier they had been pouring foundations under the assumption that the survey correction had already settled the dispute. Now the county had officially restored the original boundary. The lien against my ranch had been removed, and the project that was supposed to place 40 homes across my pasture was suddenly facing the possibility of demolition orders before a single house had even been framed. The planning director stood from his chair. "This hearing is adjourned," he said. And just like that, the dispute that had started with orange survey flags and the grass finally reached its turning point. Within a few weeks, the construction equipment disappeared from the pasture. First the bulldozers left. Then the concrete trucks. Finally, crews returned one last time, not to build, but to undo what had already been started. The 10 foundations were broken apart and hauled away in sections. Utility trenches were filled back in, and the land was graded until the surface looked almost the way it had before the project began. Grass seed was spread across the soil. By the end of the month, the only visible reminder of the dispute was a faint patch of new green growing where the concrete slabs used to sit. The lien against the ranch had been formally removed from county records. No more letters arrived from the HOA board, and the Ridge Creek expansion plans were quietly revised to stop at the original property line. Most of the neighbors who had watched the situation unfold kept their distance after that. A few offered short apologies when they passed by on the road. One evening I stood near the rebuilt fence line, looking across the pasture that had almost disappeared on paper. The land hadn't changed. The records simply caught up with the truth. Because sometimes the strongest defense isn't force or argument. Sometimes it's just one document that the system forgot to check.